I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we will explore U.S. China relations at the subnational level. While tensions between Washington and Beijing continue to define the broader bilateral relationship, U.S. states and cities have long maintained their own ties with Chinese provinces and cities. How has the trajectories of these subnational relationships evolved over recent years? What role do economic ties, trade, and people-to-people exchanges play in shaping engagement at this level? And how do local and state-level actors navigate growing U.S. federal restrictions on China-related initiatives? To explore these questions, we're joined by Dr. Kyle Jaros and Dr. Sara Newland, who will help us unpack the complexities of subnational diplomacy in an era of intensifying great power competition. Kyle Jaros is an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, where he studies the politics of urban and regional development and governance and subnational foreign affairs, with a particular focus on China. He is the author of China's Urban Champions, The Politics of Spatial Development, and has contributed extensively to leading China studies and social science journals. Dr. Jaros holds a PhD and MA in political science from Harvard University, an AB in public international affairs, along with a certificate in Chinese language and culture from Princeton University. He has also earned a graduate certificate in Chinese studies from the Hopkins Nanjing Center. Sara Newland is associate professor of government at Smith College. She is a scholar of local politics in China and Taiwan, with a research focus on how local officials operate both as domestic policymakers and as participants in international relations. Her work on local governance, public service provision, and subnational diplomacy has been featured in the China Quarterly Governance, the Pacific Review, among other venues. Dr. Newland holds a PhD and an MA from UC Berkeley and a BA from Wellesley College. Together, Dr. Jaros and Dr. Newland spent the past year as visiting fellows at the Truman Center for National Policy on a project examining city-level U.S. China relations. The white paper they have authored based on this research will be released in late February. They are also co-authoring a book on U.S. China subnational diplomacy in an era of growing great power competition. Kyle and Sara, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Bonnie. We're excited to be here.
Thanks, Bonnie.
So Kyle and Sara, why did the two of you decide to focus your research on subnational U.S.-China engagement? Why is that an important topic for you?
So for a long time, I think the role of states and localities and their Chinese counterparts in the larger U.S.-China relationship seemed like a kind of sleepy backwater in the relationship. It's sometimes described by observers as the kind of low politics area, right? Economic relations, educational links, cultural ties, sister city relationships, right? These things don't always sound like the cutting edge of geopolitics. But what's happened is that in the last 5 years, there's really been a ground shift where things that had not been front and center have become politicized and securitized in ways that really have brought them to the fore of the relationship. And we've seen that reflected in both, growing concerns about whether it's concerns about malign CCP influence operations in the U.S., whether it's concerns about espionage. On the other hand, the more active role that some local and state level leaders have been playing in trying to shift the larger trajectory of U.S.-China diplomacy during difficult moments, such as the role that politicians in California, whether at the state level with Governor Gavin Newsom or local level leaders, city level leaders, have played in trying to rekindle diplomatic relations at a time when the overall, relationship is on the rocks. I think we've seen a lot of agency happening at this part of the relationship. And we've also seen states and cities as very important sites where some of the biggest challenges are getting worked out and where these balances between the economic benefits of the U.S. relationship with China and the security risks, the human rights concerns are coming into stark opposition.
I'll just add to that I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us to learn about through the course of this research is the proliferation of different actors at the state and local level who now see some element of a relationship with China as being part of their job description. So whether that is, state treasurers weighing in on the possibility of divesting public pension funds from China, or attorneys general filing lawsuits that implicate the Chinese Communist Party, or state legislatures setting up Taiwan caucuses that are modeled on the Taiwan caucus in the U.S. House and Senate. I think we're seeing this sort of trickle-down effect where, everyone is weighing in on China policy in a way that was not the case 10 or 15 years ago. And in some cases, I think those kinds of, efforts to legislate or regulate engagement with China are an appropriate response to risks that probably were present at the local level and didn't get sufficient attention in previous decades. But I also think that in some cases, they are contributing to a kind of environment of Sinophobia and, real fear among ethnically Chinese communities and more broadly Asian heritage communities across states that see themselves as being targeted by anti-China policies within their communities or their states. And so I think it's important to think about this as a component of China policy that has not maybe gotten as much attention as things that happen at the federal level. But it's also really important to think about some of the local and community level effects of this sort of proliferation of China policy down to the state and even the city or local level.
So I'd like to start by looking at some of the trajectory and trends when it comes to Chinese subnational engagement with the United States. How have U.S. states and cities historically engaged with Chinese counterparts? And what have you seen as primary drivers of these subnational relationships?
Yeah, I'll start, Bonnie. I think there have been some longstanding person-to-person and cultural ties, often through sister city relationships, since around 1979 between U.S. cities and Chinese cities. And then later in the 1980s and 1990s, we really saw a lot of economic interest in engaging with China at the local level. And so we began to see state governors leading trade delegations to China, often bringing with them CEOs or other leaders from the business community across their state to meet with potential partners in China. And both of those forms of engagement have really continued, although, as I think we'll get to later in the podcast, there's been a real drop-off in some forms of engagement with China. But more recently, we also have seen things like educational partnerships between public universities in U.S. states and Chinese counterparts, and also new forms of engagement like environmental partnerships. So one example is a green shipping corridor between the port of Long Beach and several cities in China to try to hit a zero emissions target for, shipping that's going back and forth between those port cities.
And just looking at the subnational engagement compared to the engagement we have with China on the national level, would you say that these two types of engagement are on similar or different trajectories?
Yeah, what I think we've seen, Bonnie, is that from the mid-20 teens onward, tensions were increasingly apparent in the national level relationship between the U.S. and China, even going back to the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. And certainly in the early years of the first Trump administration, there was more and more, sort of overt competition and overt tension in the bilateral relationship. What I'd say happened at the subnational level is that business as usual, that is to say, the business from the era of engagement as usual, continued longer at the subnational level, at the state and local level, than it did in the federal government. So even into the late 20 teens, so if we're talking about 2017, 2018, 2019, it was still common to see mayors and governors traveling to China, hosting delegations from China, meeting with Chinese diplomats in very open settings, emphasizing some of the ceremonial aspects of meetings, still trying to promote trade ties, business investments. There were still discussions happening, as of the mid and late 20 teens at the state and local level about educational cooperation. So that was happening even as the first Trump administration was launching its trade war, even as the overall tenor of U.S. China relations was getting a lot worse. What I think we've seen in more recent years, so as we look over the past 5 years, is that if it took longer for some of the tensions in U.S. China relationship to reach the state and local level, there's been a more abrupt correction or even overcorrection in some cases happening at the state and local level, where we've seen longstanding ties quickly brought to an end or going dormant. Relatively few states and cities, or at least relatively few state and city leaders, are eager to be seen traveling to China, meeting with Chinese officials, even in some cases welcoming, Chinese business investment to their jurisdictions. That's very different from the way things looked 5 years ago. Certainly very different from the way things looked before the COVID pandemic. So yeah, I think I would say a longer time to react and then a very sharp kind of correction in recent years. I'd say one other thing about the sort of subnational level is just the amount of variation that we also see across the country. We've seen in recent years, I don't quite go so far as to call it bipartisan consensus on China, but a lot of bipartisan overlap in attitudes toward how to pursue China policy and goals for U.S. foreign policy toward China. At the state and local level, we see, I think, a much wider range of, understandings of where the U.S.-China relationship is, understandings of the possibilities or risks of working with China, and states that are just, positioning themselves very differently. Some still willing to openly engage and work with China, or who even see that as vital. I'm thinking here of California, cities like New York City. On the other hand, some states and localities across the U.S. that are really shunning contact with China and trying to enact new barriers to that sort of interaction.
Kyle, I wanted to follow up on one thing that you mentioned. In terms of the subnational engagement, you mentioned that in the last 5 years, there's been quite a bit of change and a number of longstanding ties were quickly brought to an end. For some of those changes that were quickly brought to an end, was it influenced by politics at the national level? Or was it, for example, not so much politics, but sanctions on certain Chinese leaders? What caused some of these subnational engagements to end abruptly?
That's a great question. This is a question that's really been motivating a lot of the research Sara and I have been doing over the past couple of years. And I think the answer is that some of both have been happening. There are some cases where federal policies or federal actions, federal messaging have sort of directly curtailed or made it difficult to continue relationships at the state and local level between the US and China. But there are other cases where it's sort of taken time for negative sentiment toward China, concerns about China, to sort of enter into the political discussion at the subnational level. But sometimes it's taken root very virulently once it's gotten there. So we see cases where the kinds of rhetoric around China in some state houses among some local leaders can be, even more vitriolic or more hawkish than what we are seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. So I do think that we have to take seriously both the ways that federal policies and warnings from the federal government about the risks of engaging with China can limit some of this subnational interaction, but it didn't cause an abrupt stop to subnational engagement. Even in, for example, the state of Indiana, where I'm based, Governor Eric Holcomb, a Republican governor, made a trip to China in 2019 in the middle of the first Trump administration's trade war, basically saying that, this is a perfect time to be going to China in service of my state's economic and business interests. Now things are looking very different in Indiana, but some of that difference, I think, is because of federal policies, but some of it is because a strong sense of concern about China and just generally very strong anti-China sentiment has taken hold more and more among state legislators and other state officials in the state. So there are definitely two different tracks or even more that we have to follow here.
Sara, Kyle had talked a bit about some of the variation that we're seeing across regions. He mentioned California, New York, Indiana. In your research, it seems like there might be a divide across red or blue states. Is that a fair characterization of what we're seeing as some of the regional differences with how U.S. states and cities engage with China?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, I think there are some pretty clear partisan differences in terms of the rise of anti-China policies coming out of state legislatures, but also coming out of governors' offices through things like state-level executive orders, where it's pretty clear that red states have kind of leaned into confrontational anti-China policies at the state level in a way that blue states have not. That said, I think the story of economic engagement is really a lot more complicated than just partisan dynamics. So, for instance, in New England, there just isn't as much of a deep history of engagement with China as there are in some other parts of the country. I think geographically, it makes sense perhaps for New England to be more closely tied to economic partners in Europe. The nature of industry in some New England states just doesn't really lend itself very much to a kind of import-export based relationship with Chinese partners. And so as a result, we've seen that the New England states have been fairly quiet on China. They were never doing that much economically with China relative to some other parts of the country. And so maybe the drop off in engagement hasn't been quite as steep as it has elsewhere, but they're also not really leaning into a lot of, cooperation with China in the cultural realm or others. But, there are places in the Midwest that have really strong economic ties historically with China. Kyle and I were both in Des Moines, Iowa over the summer, and that's a place where the agriculture industry in Iowa is deeply dependent on economic ties with China. And so on the one hand, it's a pretty red state at this point, and there are certainly pockets of really strong anti-China sentiment, but I think there's also a lot of pragmatism and recognition that a high percentage of pork and soybeans and corn from Iowa winds up getting sent to China, and that the two places are almost inextricably linked together. So really a lot of variation across the country, I think, in terms of what those ties looked like 15 years ago, but also in terms of how different areas are reacting now.
And I would just add quickly, just to emphasize what Sarah's saying, there is this sort of overall pattern that we've seen probably greater enthusiasm from red states and in some cases from Republican legislators and politicians, but it's not exclusively a Republican-Democrat divide. It's not exclusively a coastal heartland divide. This really cuts across a lot of different layers. And, we've seen measures in some states that are being introduced by Democratic politicians as well as Republican politicians. I think at this point, in terms of the aggregate data that we've collected, that other researchers like Flora Yen have collected, the majority of sponsorship of anti-China or anti-CCP legislation in state houses across the country is coming from Republicans, but there is a significant share that's still coming from Democratic politicians. And that sort of in some ways matches the pattern also at the federal level, where there's a lot of sponsorship coming from Republican politicians, but there's also a significant involvement and in some cases effort to work together across party lines. And there can also be really sharp divides, as Sarah alluded to, within traditional party camps. The traditional establishment business wing of the Republican Party was very much in favor of economic engagement with China. That looks quite different from the position of a lot of MAGA Republican politicians.
Could we delve a little bit deeper into some of the key metrics on how we can measure the strength of subnational U.S.-China relations? Kyle, you mentioned that there's been quite a bit of decline in the last 5 years or so. And one of the years in which we saw some of the high levels of engagement was in 2017. Do you have a sense of what are some data points that we can use to compare subnational engagement from 2017 compared to now?
We've been looking at a number of different indicators in the work we've done. Sarah and I published a paper in the journal Publius, Journal of Federalism, in 2023 that tracks a number of different sort of basic indicators of state level engagement with China, as well as state level sort of confrontational policies toward China. When it comes to, I think, some of the most obvious metrics, and I think politically important metrics like official visits by U.S. governors, U.S. mayors to China, as well as, incoming visits by Chinese delegations to have meetings with high-level U.S. officials at the state and local level. Those kinds of meetings have had a dramatic decline in recent years. They probably peaked in most cases in the early to mid 2010s. They were already on a decline before COVID, but they really flatlined across the board for obvious reasons during the COVID pandemic because travel was suspended between the countries, but they never recovered. In the period since the COVID pandemic and China's travel controls ended, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, who made a trip to China in November of 2023, remains the only U.S. governor to have made a visit to China. That's very unlike the pattern in the previous decade when there were dozens of trips by U.S. governors. In fact, governors like Rick Snyder, a Republican from Michigan, he made as many as 7 or 8 trips over the course of, I think, a 2-term tenure as governor. So these numbers are way down when we look at sort of these political indicators at the top level. There are a lot of other indicators that I think are important to track. Some of these as, underlying drivers of these relationships, as Sarah hinted at earlier, and some of them as sort of evidence that politicians and other policymakers want to maintain these links. But some of the other kinds of important indicators to track, are things like trade and investment ties between U.S. states and cities in China, many of which, remain fairly strong. Chinese foreign direct investment into the U.S. has certainly plummeted over the last several years, but there are still U.S. businesses that in recent years have been making major investments in production facilities in China. There's still large volumes of trade flowing back and forth between U.S. states and China. So there's still a deep and interconnected relationship when it comes to trade and supply chains. We also still, can follow pretty tight educational linkages between the two countries. The number of international students in the U.S. from China has certainly declined by a significant proportion, but there are still hundreds of thousands of Chinese students at U.S. universities right now. So there is still, very strong kinds of two-way flows taking place. These relationships have dramatically narrowed, I think. They've also, in some cases, lowered in intensity, but there are still very tight kinds of connections, love them or hate them, that are binding together U.S. states and cities with China more broadly.
We've talked a bit about some of the incentives as well as concerns that local officials may have of traveling to China. And I guess it's probably relatively straightforward on some of the trade and investment ties. But what do you see as some of the main drivers in this decline on the university and civil society side?
Well, maybe I'll start and see if Sarah wants to add anything. On the side of universities, there was a period in the 2010s, I think especially, when international student enrollments from China were surging at U.S. universities, when there also was a rapid growth of joint programs involving U.S. universities and Chinese counterparts in China. There were still robust numbers of U.S. students traveling to China to study. There were also, far-reaching research partnerships, efforts to, create international or transnational teams of researchers. So those kinds of agreements were flourishing at a moment when I think security concerns had not risen to the level that they currently have in the U.S. China relationship, or at least when universities, business actors, and others, maybe outside the Beltway, were not thinking in as focused a way about some of the security liabilities involved. Since there's been a real paradigm shift in thinking about the kinds of risks involved in working closely with Chinese counterparts, whether these are concerns over IP theft, whether they're concerns about espionage, whether they're concerns about talent recruitment programs, and more importantly, just the larger sense that the bilateral relationship has congealed into a really overt, geopolitical competition with more zero-sum terms. I think there's just been a lot more hesitancy from the federal government level to allow these kinds of partnerships to go forward. And so the federal government has sent clear signals that it both expects much more attention to compliance with a changing set of federal rules, and also has, in many cases, I think, created a chilling effect for university cooperation with China. Universities have their own reasons to be guarded, particularly as the growth market for study abroad in China, as the permissible areas of cooperation with China have dropped, and as just reputational risks that universities perceive from doing business in China or having very close ties or having a physical presence in China have increased. Universities have also gotten cold feet and really scaled back some of their growth plans. But universities are also protecting a lot of the programs that they've built up over time, many of which they think are extremely worthwhile with limited security spillovers. And so universities are trying to protect what they see as really important academic functions. They're trying to preserve open academic links. Academia is inherently a global thing, and China is a key part of the global academic system at this moment. And so there's a mixed picture there as well. But universities have certainly got more careful, and the federal government has created a lot of deterrent to deepening those relationships.
I would just add a couple of pieces to that. So one piece is that I think universities are confronting declining interest in China from U.S. students. So some of the interest in studying abroad in China or studying Chinese has declined, perhaps in part due to the fact that students don't see a clear pathway to, move to China to work or study abroad after they graduate. I think students have also gotten the message that if they're interested in working in a field that requires a security clearance, spending significant time in China may actually be a liability and make that difficult. And so I think there's just less interest from the student side in some of the exchange programs that universities used to run. The last thing also that I want to highlight is that although I think that federal pressure is really important, and so things like the now shuttered, at least temporarily, FBI China initiative, I think really created a sort of environment of fear on campuses for university faculty of Chinese heritage and more generally those who were working with partners in China. And, other federal signals, universities have essentially closed the Confucius Institutes in response to federal pressure. But I also think it's important to note that states in some cases are really going out, even further than what's being required by the federal government in terms of trying to limit partnerships with China. One of the states that Kyle and I have been following really closely in our research is Florida. Florida in 2023 passed a law that has been interpreted in a way that's essentially made it impossible for public universities in Florida to recruit Chinese graduate students because they're unable to pay them a stipend without going through a very sort of laborious appeals process. And so I think universities on their own, in some cases, are making a decision to severely limit the presence of Chinese students who for a long time have been a key source of tuition revenue, but also a key source of human capital in labs as researchers. It's becoming just much more difficult for them to find a place on some public university campuses in particular.
And Sara, let me follow up on that. You mentioned Florida has passed legislation to make it more difficult for public universities to recruit Chinese graduate students. In what other locales are you seeing similar legislation or policies being rolled out, either in other cities or in other states? Is it becoming more widespread, or is it still just in pockets of places?
So I think at this point, it's mostly in pockets of places. There was a bill in Texas that would have banned the recruitment of Chinese students. I'm not sure if it was just graduate students or all students at public universities, but the bill didn't move forward. I think one of the things that we've seen in some areas of policy is that there's a pretty rapid sort of diffusion or contagion effect from some states to others. So there are now versions of land ban ban laws that prevent Chinese individuals or companies from buying either agricultural land or any land or land near military institutions or critical infrastructure. Those were bills that just a couple of years ago were really only in a handful of states. And now a majority of states have some version of a land ban law or land ban bill somewhere in the legislative process. So, I think something like the restrictions that have been put in place in Florida, it's an extreme case. I don't think we've seen other bills passing yet that look exactly the way the Florida one does. But I also think we often see rapid diffusion just within the course of 1 to 2 legislative sessions of some of these ideas across a pretty wide swath of the U.S.
And I'd also like to switch gears a bit and talk about what we're seeing in terms of Chinese interest in engaging with U.S. counterparts. So it was mentioned earlier that Governor Newsom was the last U.S. governor to travel to China. And I think, Kyle, you mentioned this, that there are also visits by PRC delegations. Are we also seeing less interest from the Chinese end to engage on the subnational level, or do we see even more interest from their end because there's limited opportunities to engage at the national level, but little receptivity on the U.S. side?
More to the second point, there's been a lot of observers see as a kind of diplomatic charm offensive happening since the resumption of travel at the end of COVID, and especially since 2023. There have been dozens, probably hundreds of Chinese official or quasi-official delegations coming to the U.S., in many cases seeking to meet not just with actors in government at the state and local level, but also seeking to meet with businesses, universities, other institutions. They haven't always found a very welcoming audience. So in many parts of the country, especially in the center of the U.S. and the heartland states, it's been harder and harder for incoming delegations to find U.S. officials who are willing to sort of openly meet with them and shake hands in front of a display of both countries' flags. But nevertheless, the delegations have kept coming. And in places like California, where there's been greater receptiveness to dialogue, at least, even if some forms of cooperation have become more difficult, they are finding more audiences with state and local officials. But I would say that these kinds of visits from Chinese officials, from business delegations, from university delegations, have been happening almost at a fever pitch. Whether that continues, whether there are visas granted during the second Trump administration that we are now in, is a question we're going to have to wait and see the answer to. But certainly during the last year of the Biden administration's time in office, there was a pretty significant flow of these kinds of travel. So what we can glean from that, as well as from just the very overt rhetoric of Chinese diplomats and from the top Chinese leadership, is that China puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of subnational relations at a time when the bilateral relationship overall is strained and when it can be hard to get access to officials in DC. So I think there was a period where especially access to U.S. governors, maybe state legislators, was seen as at least a temporary substitute for having better access to federal officials in DC. What the Chinese diplomats have found is that in many cases now it's also hard to find meetings with state level officials in the US. Whether there's been a greater shift of China's emphasis to the very local level, sort of cities and other local governments, or whether that's just a kind of perceptual shift is a little hard to tell without comprehensive statistics. And as far as we can tell, only the federal government probably has fairly comprehensive statistics on these incoming delegations, and even they may not have a systematic picture. But there's been a lot of this kind of activity, and it's clearly driven in part, again, by this larger diplomatic strategy of working around Beijing and trying to stabilize the U.S. China relationship by finding friendly counterparts in the U.S. who are willing to continue cooperating or who might be willing to amplify some of the sort of shared concerns that China has about the trade war, about U.S. China rivalry and tensions. But I think it's also genuinely driven by interest of Chinese provinces, localities, universities, Chinese businesses who have limited opportunities, right now domestically in China to improve the economic outlook. As China's economy has been going through a number of difficult adjustments, as the real estate-led economy in China has really cooled off, local governments, cities are eager to boost investment. They're eager to find international partners. Private entrepreneurs from China are eager to find markets outside of China to expand into. So some of that works in conjunction with, efforts by the Chinese leadership to try to extend Chinese business outward, especially in strategic sectors like clean energy. But some of it, I think, is also just driven by commercial motives or by very local concerns of China's provincial and local governments.
And as these Chinese counterparts are seeing doors being closed or less opportunities in the United States, have you seen them lean more on local Chinese or ethnic Chinese communities? Because that's something that we've noticed in terms of them targeting different actors to try to influence. So are we seeing in the past couple of years either more engagement or more activity by these local Chinese or ethnic Chinese communities to engage with China versus in the prior years where there may have been just more engagement overall?
I think it's very hard for us to say that there's an increase in this kind of activity. I think this has been going on in the background, throughout the last couple of decades. The PRC attempts to maintain and build close ties with diaspora communities. It tries to be a factor in the sort of, discussions within these communities, within policy debates. It tries to exercise a voice and influence in the media outlets that serve these communities. There's also an effort clearly under the United Front system, right, to maintain points of contact that are influential within diaspora communities. I don't think that's at all new. There's clearly been a ramping up of the sophistication and resources of the United Front system broadly under Xi Jinping, and that's been documented by a number of scholars. But whether that's new or whether the U.S. has become just a lot more sensitive to it as high-profile concerning cases like the allegations that have been brought against Linda Sun in New York or Winnie Greco in New York City, as these kinds of cases make the headlines in the U.S., I think more people are aware of this. But again, it's very hard to say that the actual amount of activity is new. And in some cases, it seems like, maybe kinds of activity that would have been seen as unremarkable a decade ago or that were just not receiving comparable attention are now getting a lot more attention, I think appropriately. But I think it's hard to differentiate our perception from the baseline levels of what's going on.
And Sarah, given this decline overall on the U.S. side, how have you seen U.S. subnational actors adjust or rethink their China policies, particularly given the greater intensity of U.S. China competition at the national level?
So for many actors, I think their approach has just been to pull back pretty dramatically from engagement with China. As Kyle noted, there still are some places like California where there's a fair amount of two-way engagement still happening. But California increasingly looks like it's sort of in a class by itself. And some of the other states that were doing a lot of engagement with China in the early 2010s have really ceased doing that kind of engagement. So that's one approach. I think another approach that some places are taking is a kind of quiet behind the scenes approach to subnational diplomacy. So there might still be meetings happening between someone from the city government and someone from a visiting Chinese delegation. But instead of those meetings happening in front of the cameras, they're happening kind of quietly behind the scenes with no press release, no photos. And so, I think those kinds of private or quiet paradiplomacy are a little more difficult to track than some of what was happening before. And, in some areas, I think there are still efforts to kind of affirmatively defend and stand up for forms of cooperation, whether those are climate cooperation, whether those are the value of educational exchanges. Some people are trying to affirmatively make those cases, but on the whole, I think there are very few politicians right now who are willing to sort of stand up and make the case for why they see those relationships as valuable to their communities, because the domestic political risks are so high, even if they genuinely see them as valuable. And we've heard from lots of people across the political spectrum that they do see real value in some of these forms of local exchange. That's not a case that they feel like they can make in a public way, especially if they're in a position where they are vulnerable to a sort of challenge from another candidate at election time.
So when you look at how individual states, locales, or university or civil society actors engage with China, I'm assuming that they're all more or less operating independently, right? There's no national level or federal level guidance on how to engage China. But please correct me if I'm wrong, if there is an understood policy for what you should or should not do with the Chinese.
It's a great question. And of course, there's a big contrast between what we see on the U.S. side, where we have a federal system, where we also have a lot of, genuinely private or grassroots institutions that are involved in U.S. China relations at different levels, and the Chinese system, where you have a hierarchical government structure, Leninist in its sort of logic, where subnational governments, although they have a certain amount of operational autonomy, still have to operate within the policy frameworks and rules set by Beijing, and they do have to follow policy directives and answer to those priorities, and where there's also an extensive, web of sort of quasi-governmental or quasi-party entities like the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which, do a lot of the coordination of this para-diplomacy or this subnational diplomatic engagement. So there's a huge institutional and informational mismatch between the US side and the Chinese side. It's easy on the one hand to see how that creates an advantage for China to take the initiative or to sort of outmaneuver or to try to divide and conquer, as it were, US counterparts. And I think there's some truth to that. On the other hand, there's actually probably enormous difficulty from the Chinese perspective in figuring out how to reach and persuade and maintain relations with all these different actors on the US side. So there is also, I think, a strength in the pluralism of the US system and the sort of federal character and just the more generally dispersed character of actors and agency on the US side. But that's not to say that the US side is totally without coordination. There's certainly no rigid top-down coordination of state and local engagement with China coming from Washington, D.C. We may see the new administration trying to do more to shape the contours of what states and localities are doing in their interactions with China. Certainly, the federal government can control issuance of visas for travel and can make life more difficult for state and local actors who make trips to China if they do so in defiance of the administration's policies. But at least historically, the federal government has mostly either used messaging to encourage or to discourage certain forms of subnational relations with China. And that's really varied over time. So the Obama administration was supportive of a number of platforms for subnational interaction between US governors and mayors and Chinese counterparts on issues like climate change or sort of smart city development. Under the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, along with FBI Director Christopher Wray, gave a kind of warning to subnational leaders in the US that they needed to be careful that their Chinese counterparts might be taking advantage of them or manipulating them for political or diplomatic reasons. In the process, of course, kind of discouraging some of these kinds of contacts. But that in and of itself, as I've said earlier, didn't bring these things to a stop. So there wasn't an outright effort to control these kinds of contacts. And the Biden administration was actually a lot more deferential to states and cities about pursuing the kinds of global relationships that they wanted to pursue and saw as being in their own interest, as long as they did not contravene U.S. foreign policy, break U.S. laws. At the same time, the Biden administration and its officials were very careful to try to give state and local officials the information that they needed to navigate these interactions safely. So the Subnational Diplomacy Unit within the State Department was set up as a way to try to provide more information for U.S. mayors and governors and other local officials and other entities who were interacting with China and other foreign countries to make sure that they understood U.S. policies, understood what issues were at stake, understood potential risks of these interactions. Other federal agencies like the FBI have also provided extensive briefings about, the risks of engagement or about best practices for engaging with Chinese official or unofficial counterparts to state and local officials in the U.S. So that's created a coordination or at least a consultation between different levels in the US. And I think there's a much better flow of information than there was 10 years ago. But I think we see and we've found in our research that there's still a long way to go in improving these kinds of coordination mechanisms. There's still really a need for better information sharing platforms. There's still a need for better real-time communication. And there's still just not a capacity to transfer the expertise from the federal government or from institutions that have it to the mayors or local organizations that are working closely with China day to day. So there's work to be done.
And Kyle, that's a really good segue to the so what. We've talked about the general decline in subnational U.S.-China engagement, but the big question is, are we missing or losing anything here? And what you just mentioned suggests that at least previously, with the amount of engagement we had, some of the local actors might not have been aware of some of the security and other risks of engaging China. But are you seeing that we're on a net gaining or losing from the significant decrease in subnational engagement?
Just to reiterate what we said a little bit in different terms, 10 years ago, I think, or maybe 15 years ago, the focus was entirely on upsides with very little attention to downsides of these kinds of interaction. China was seen as a huge potential market for U.S. exporters. It was seen as a source of investment and students that U.S. communities could bring in to support their economies. China has been and remains a key source of talent for the U.S. economy, for U.S. research institutions. It's also just a very important part of the world in its own right. And it's a part of the world, where it's culturally important to understand on its own terms. And there are also large communities within the U.S. that trace their ancestry to China and, have a very legitimate desire to understand and maintain contact with it. There's a lot of important aspects that motivated the earlier wave of engagement. A lot of that is, I think, getting less attention now as security concerns and just the political toxicity of anything China related is kind of dominating debates, both at the federal level and at the state and local level in many parts of the US. There is a loss from this. And I think that Sara and I in our research, including our forthcoming white paper from the Truman Center that's going to be released shortly, we see that there have been real costs to communities from overly rapid or overly hasty severing of some of these ties. And Sara may want to elaborate more on that. This remains a really active issue, and I don't think it's done as we head into the second Trump administration. I think China is likely to maintain and in some cases even redouble its outreach to U.S. states and localities as it faces a more unpredictable partner in the White House. And how that looks on the U.S. side and how U.S. states and localities respond is really going to be important because they have important equities involved in this relationship. And there are also these genuine risks that we've been alluding to. So getting that balance right is really crucial.
One of the things that I think we've heard in different ways across different parts of the country is that the sort of rush to completely decouple or pull back from engagement with China is challenging for localities because often there is no alternative to whatever they were depending on in their relationship with China. And so, one example of this is places that are trying to make a transition to something like 100% electric fleet of public transportation buses, places that are interested in building a domestic EV supply chain. Really, if they're not going to import components from China, if they want to produce them here, they're going to need to be able to, license Chinese technology or work with Chinese companies in order to do that. For some places, they're sort of caught in this bind where they have clear environmental sustainability goals or economic development goals that in order to meet those goals, they need to have some kind of contact, some kind of relationship with Chinese partners or Chinese firms. And that's really difficult politically, or in some cases impossible politically in this current moment. And so, I think it's important to keep those losses in mind. I think the other thing that I would highlight is, we've talked to a lot of people across the country who have been involved in things like local sister city relationships or cultural exchange programs. And I think sometimes these get dismissed as sort of fluffy or unimportant, but they really bring a lot of value to people's lives. And I think in particular for communities that aren't very international and where there maybe aren't, other alternatives that are exposing local students or local communities to forms of art and culture and food from other parts of the world, whether it's China or elsewhere. The cancellation of those programs or the sense that somehow those programs are suddenly toxic because the Chinese government poses a danger to the U.S., I think people really feel the loss of the value to those local communities. So on the one hand, I think those kinds of programs, don't get top billing in comparison with some of the bigger, meatier economic or political issues. But I do think it's important to highlight that there's something that really, in many cases, were sort of low risk programs that have been sort of swept aside as tensions between the U.S. and China have risen in ways that I think have incurred real costs.
One thing we want to stress, and one thing that we also stress in our forthcoming white paper, is that we think that these kinds of ties are valuable if they are conducted properly and carefully by actors on the U.S. side. It is true, and there's ample documentation that China has tried to use, in some cases, interactions with state and local governments or its presence in local communities to advance agendas or to engage in behavior that violates U.S. laws or that, in any case, is contrary to U.S. policy interests. And so it's really important for local actors to be well informed about what the risks are. But not all Chinese activity in the U.S. and certainly not all Chinese people are malign. And a lot of the behavior is not only innocuous, but has been beneficial to U.S. communities. A big part of that is obvious in the tremendous amounts of talent that we've talked about in U.S. universities and businesses, including in a lot of cutting edge parts of our economy that depend on talent and ingenuity from Chinese diaspora and migrant communities. An important part of this is in the business world, where there are still very strong trade and investment links between the two countries. Businesses in the U.S. have chosen to be very low-key, talking about their China links, but they remain massively connected to Chinese supply chains that continue to export large quantities of goods to China. Many U.S. jobs continue to depend on export markets. Many U.S. manufacturers continue to depend critically on parts that are sourced from Chinese companies, whether those companies are located in China or outside China's borders. So there has been no economic decoupling. And to manage that economic relationship, which exists and which is a fact for all these communities in different different levels across the country, it's really important to have a conversational relationship. That doesn't mean that we are going to agree on a lot of things, and we may disagree on many. And it doesn't mean that we should be seeking cooperation with all the various types of actors from the Chinese side who are, presenting themselves to work with the U.S. But it does mean that an informed and careful approach to contact, and in some cases selective cooperation at the subnational level, stays really important. And it's important, as we said, both for the educational and economic outlook of different localities. It's also important at a more fundamental level, keep open various lines of communication, right, as a kind of diplomatic portfolio that serves U.S. interests, right? Different lines of contact with China to hear what the concerns are of our Chinese counterparts. Also, to make sure that we're not dehumanizing one another. We're at a very dangerous moment right now in world politics. And if that dehumanization continues, it makes it easier for catastrophic wars to break out. So both sides have a deep interest. This is not just a U.S. interest, it's a Chinese interest too, in making sure that human contacts continue and that people know and recognize and can communicate with one another and understand one another's concerns.
To add to this point about the importance of keeping open channels of communication, I think it's important to remember that these relationships at the local level, in many cases, are extremely long-standing. These are between people who have known each other and worked together for, in some cases, many decades. And I think that those can be a really important source of information, both for actors at the local level in the U.S., but also as a source of information for national policymakers as well. I think often these relationships are ones that can help sort of keep our finger on the pulse of changes that are happening in China, things that are being communicated to these local level officials that are coming sort of down the pipeline from the province they work in or ultimately from Beijing. But I also think that they can be an important way to communicate real concerns that are arising at the local level and in federal policy in the US to Chinese counterparts who might actually be in a position to listen. And so, one example that we have heard about over the course of our research is the example of fentanyl and, the fact that it's perhaps easier for US mayors and governors to communicate in a meaningful way about the impacts of fentanyl in their communities to their Chinese partners. That's much less abstract. It's more concrete and ultimately maybe more effective for them to be the sort of messengers about the significance of that issue than it is for folks who are at the federal level. And our understanding is that the visit that Gavin Newsom made to China, this was one of the issues that he raised, and that it was helpful for sort of restarting U.S. China cooperation at the national level around counter narcotics. So, I think that there are many ways in which these local channels of communication, I think some people tend to look at them through a lens of vulnerability. And I think it's important to be clear-eyed about the ways in which those vulnerabilities can arise. But it's also important to see them as an opportunity to learn more about what's happening in the sort of structure of the administrative state in China, but also to communicate U.S. priorities back to some of those Chinese partners.
Perfect. Thank you. I would like to close off this podcast with inviting both of you to share any thoughts you might have for how the United States, particularly at the national level, should think about these types of subnational engagements in the future. I think both of you have suggested a number of ways that we should be careful, but also continue to allow some of these engagements to occur. But I just wanted to make sure that as we're wrapping up, that you had an opportunity to highlight whatever points that you think need to be reemphasized again.
I think a lot of actors at the local level are going to make their own decisions about whether they want to engage with foreign counterparts. And so it's important for actors at the federal level to create the kinds of resources and conditions that allow for local engagement on the smartest and safest terms possible. So one of the things that Kyle and I have advocated for elsewhere is the creation of more resources that are easily available to local officials to try to help them better understand the Chinese counterparts they might be engaging with. So to understand which groups might be aligned with the United Front, to try to understand the structure of the local state in China. So if they're approached by a delegation, they can get a better sense of who they're engaging with. And also to create platforms that enable knowledge sharing between different cities and states, because there's a lot of knowledge that some of these local level actors in the US have built up through their various engagements with Chinese partners. And right now, there isn't an easy way for them to share that knowledge with others at the city and state level or with those at the federal level. Kyle mentioned mentioned the subnational diplomacy unit as one important node in this kind of system, but I think there has to be more, and not just coordinated through the federal government, but also through things like the philanthropic sector to try to kind of enable greater knowledge sharing so that when cities or states go into this kind of engagement, they're really going in as well informed as they can be.
I would encourage federal policymakers to step back and really look at the state and local level of the relationship, not just through a defensive lens or through a sort of sense of vulnerability. There's been, I think, this kind of widely used metaphor lately that state and local relations with China are the soft underbelly of the U.S. China relationship. And I just think that if that metaphor was ever true, it's not true now. State and local officials, as we've learned through our communication with them, as well as other actors at the local level, are far more attuned to risks than they were, a decade ago or even 5 years ago. They are taking action to be more cautious. They're looking for resources to help them in that effort, as Sara mentioned. And in some cases, they're erring on the side of caution rather than even taking risks that might be justified given the potential rewards of interacting with or venturing into limited kinds of cooperation with Chinese partners. So it's important to think about this, first of all, from a kind of risk-reward perspective, but it's also important to put it in perspective at a moment when there are new kinds of vulnerability in the federal government, right? If we're concerned about espionage, if we're concerned about political influence, and the relative importance in that respect of the state and local level, I think, has now diminished. And so the question is, how can we best utilize the state and local interactions with China, both on behalf of local communities, which have their own needs, and also on behalf of U.S. diplomatic and foreign policy interests more broadly? So again, I think we need to be proactive rather than just defensive here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sara and Kyle. A lot to think through, and really appreciate your groundbreaking work tracking all the differences as well as changes in U.S. China subnational engagement. I just want to flag here that Sara and Kyle have a forthcoming publication on this issue, and once it's out, we'll link it to this podcast for our listeners. Thank you both for joining me today, and really appreciate this wide-ranging discussion.
Thank you, Bonnie. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Bonnie.